On Monday, the Israeli military saw the deadliest single incident for its forces since the war with Hamas began October 7th. Israeli officials confirmed 21 soldiers were killed near the Gaza border. Another 3 Israeli soldiers died Monday during the combat in the southern part of the enclave. The military is now focusing its efforts around Gaza's second largest city, Khan Yunis, which is considered a major advance in the war, which has caused widespread death and destruction while displacing millions of Palestinians. But it's unclear whether the move will bring Israel closer to its goal of defeating Hamas or freeing the roughly 130 hostages still being held captive by the militant group. According to the Associated Press, a 2-month ceasefire proposal was on the table in which hostages would be freed in exchange for the release of Palestinians detained in Israel, and top Hamas leaders would be allowed to leave Gaza and relocate to other countries. But is there enough pressure to cut a deal? I'm joined by Michael Boyle, Associate Professor of Political Science at Rutgers Camden. Professor Boyle, always good to talk to you. Let me just ask you first about where this offensive is headed. We saw a very deadly day for the Israeli military, some 24 soldiers in total who were killed. Now they're fighting in this very densely populated area. It seems as though it only gets worse from here.
It does. The center of operations has shifted to the south around Khan Yunis, and that is also a stronghold of Hamas fighters, as well as a very densely populated area. And so this is going to be much harder fighting with probably much higher casualties. And what's recently happened, where 24 Israeli soldiers were killed in what looks like a failed detonation around a building, is only going to apply more pressure to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to end this offensive early. This, plus the growing pressure from the United States and Europe, is going to lead a lot of people to ask the question, can he really politically sustain intense street fighting in the south? And especially as it pushes more and more to the refugee populations have been pushed to the south.
Well, and it's interesting because the public sentiment has really taken a shift, not just from the U.S. and Europe, which we saw happen a little earlier on, but also in Israel about the protracted nature of this war and the hostages in particular. How does that play into the chances for perhaps a ceasefire or an end to the war?
So there's growing pressure within Israel, in part because the estimate is that there's at least 100 hostages that Israeli intelligence thinks are still alive. We know that unfortunately at least 20 to 30 have been killed in the course of the war itself. And increasingly families in Israel are saying it's time to prioritize the return of the hostages over what Netanyahu is promising, which is victory over Hamas. And if we start to think about those two goals, it might be that they're in sort of incommensurate. That is to say that if you absolutely destroy Hamas in the way that he's talking about doing so, you might risk the lives of the hostages, you might produce a greater humanitarian disaster. And so increasingly there's domestic pressure saying that he's doing this for his own survival, that Netanyahu is running for re-election on the promise of an absolute victory over Hamas, which is itself an illusion. It's impossible to completely extinguish Hamas, and even if you did, you do so at the cost of these lives. So I think that is shaping the background context for a negotiated deal. There is a negotiation going on, mediated partially by Qatar and Egypt, about possibly releasing hostages in up to as much of a 2-month ceasefire. Now, Netanyahu's arguing that it would be a 2-month ceasefire. It wouldn't be an end to the war, but it would relieve the pressure by getting out more of the hostages, if not all of the hostages. But it would also entail some real significant costs, because Hamas is arguing for a release of Palestinian prisoners. And that itself is a costly move. And the question is, who do you release and how many do you release in order to get the 100 hostages back?
Well, I mean, Qatar in particular is playing this really pivotal role, at least according to reports, in terms of these negotiations. But have they taken a turn since Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu made comments about the potential of a 2-state solution and the fact that he doesn't see that being a possibility when it comes to the security of Israel?
So I think the hostage negotiation deals that have been going on by Qatar and Egypt, there have been at least 2 different proposals on the table, one from Hamas and one from Israel itself, talking about different terms. Israel's terms are essentially a 2-month break in the fighting, release of all the hostages, limited Palestinian prisoner release. Hamas is asking essentially for a complete end of the war and withdrawal of IDF forces from Gaza for those same hostages. So it's unclear to me with those 2 kind of table proposals where we get to and whether there is a deal that is struck. The larger political context, which is, how long will Qatar and Egypt continue to play a constructive mediating role when Netanyahu's ruling out a Palestinian state as a kind of foregone conclusion is an interesting question, because U.S. policy, European policy, and Arab state policy is all premised on a Palestinian state, a two-state solution.
Right.
And if Israel takes this off the table, it's not clear they continue to want to make his life easier or to negotiate deals essentially on his behalf. And if he's going to require Arab state cooperation in post-war Gaza, it may be the cost may be essentially reversing that and allowing some form of a Palestinian state.
Professor Michael Boyle, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you.